our next session on better integrating assessment and modeling of land use for climate and biodiversity vectors. So to try and keep to time, if you want to stay in this session, please come and sit down. Otherwise, go find the other ones that you like. I'm going to hand over to my co-chair, Aline, now to give a bit of an introduction, and then we'll get into our talks. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. Joe and I are co-chairing this session on the role of land and biodiversity and climate. And just to put everybody on the same page, we know more and more that climate and biodiversity crises are interconnected, and we have global solutions to stop and reverse biodiversity loss, solutions for climate to achieve net zero, but all these global solutions, they have to become reality. And in order to have that, we need more and more regional approaches. So in this session, we are going to hear from Miguel Moreira on the multi-level stakeholder engagement in Portugal. Then we are going to have Sarah Jones talking about pathways for sustainable land use and food systems in the UK. She will also mention co-creation with Wales government. Federico Frank will give perspectives from Argentina, and he and his team helped to define targets for the NDC and NBSAPs in Argentina. Then we are going to have Steffi talking about cocoa agroforestry in Bahia, Brazil. Mitch talking about credibility or how to make biodiversity criticisms around biodiversity credit market. Jessica will talk about the opportunity costs, UK perspective, but can also be global. And unfortunately, Daniel couldn't make it, and he was going to talk about the multiple benefits of nature-based solutions. Thank you for coming. So Miguel is in another session, so let's start with the second one, which is Sarah Jones.
That's all right. Do you have Aline? Thank you. Okay, thanks. Today I'm going to talk about the work of my PhD, which was all about integrating different models for pathways for sustainable land use and food systems in the UK. So just as by way of introduction, I'm sure we're all aware there's significant global awareness of the core challenges of climate change and biodiversity loss. In the UK, current land use is unsustainable and will be unable to achieve the climate and biodiversity targets. Business as usual is insufficient, with alternative configurations of land necessary to make land use for net zero. And in the UK, policymakers must understand what policy actions support these different alternative configurations and the feasibility of the pathways, as well as some wider implications. So to that end, the aim of my PhD was to examine alternative pathways for land use and food systems in the UK and its devolved nations to achieve national and international climate for biodiversity targets, as well as providing evidence for decision makers to develop effective policy. So before I get into the work, I wanted to provide some study context. So the UK is comprised of the devolved administrations of England, Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland in graph A. Agriculture, environment and land use policy is devolved in the UK, which means each of these governments have their own authority over environment, agriculture and land use policy. However, it is the UK government that controls the financial budget as well as trade. These policy ambitions also differ between these nations. Scotland and Wales, are considered to have quite ambitious environmental policies, whereas Northern Ireland is considered to have a weak history of environmental governance. Land use in the UK is quite diverse, so we have arable areas in the southeast of England, and then grasslands across much of Wales and Northern Ireland, and natural habitats up in Scotland. So land is predominantly used for agriculture, 42% is grasslands and 24% is arable, and we only have 8% of the UK that is forested. So this different land use context and this different political context mean the capability of each of those countries to contribute to their own, as well as the UK's climate targets, can differ. So for this work, I developed pathways for sustainable land use and food systems. Now, I'm sure many people here don't need telling, but pathways consist of different strategies from moving from the current situation towards a desired future vision or a set of specified targets. The pathways within this piece of work encompass a wide range of different policy measures and different targets across the land use and food sector. So they include changes in demand, which is population, food waste and diets, different land use management, so afforestation, some stocking densities and peeling restoration, as well as biodiversity conservation. And we also have some innovation, so different crop and livestock productivity. For the first piece of the work, I co-created pathways in collaboration with the Welsh Government. They had a desire to test an alternative configuration of land use that aligned more with their own national policies rather than that of the recommended at the UK level. So we developed 4 pathways with government, a current trends, a slight improvement, this land sparing pathway and a land sharing pathway. For the rest of the devolved nations, I conducted a systematic policy review which reviewed current and aspirational policies of the devolved administrations, as well as looking at recommendations from the UK's independent advisory body, the Committee on Climate Change, who advises the UK government on all things climate net zero. So we did 3 pathways that compare their recommended pathway with that of the devolved administrations. So, to quantify the pathways, I used the Fable calculator, which is an open source Excel-based tool to study the potential evolution of food and land use systems between 2000 and 2050. It was developed by the Fable Consortium, which is a global network of institutes, researchers who are all looking at national strategies for sustainable land use and food systems. Now, I won't go into too much detail in the interest of time, so happy to take any questions on this afterwards, but the calculator is demand-driven, so we start with population, diet, food waste, imports and exports, and we calculate what demand there'll be in the future. We then look at what the land needed to meet those targets would be, to meet that demand, sorry, and we also consider constraints such as urban and forest expansion. So the outputs that I'm particularly interested in were land use change, greenhouse gas emissions, and land for biodiversity. So quickly, some key findings. So across the 4 nations, the findings indicate that continuing as usual will not be sufficient to meet any of the UK or devolved administrations' climate and biodiversity targets. However, the land use and agricultural sector became a net carbon sink in both of the CCC and the devolved pathways. So this is a graph which shows the cumulative land use change emissions per country for each of the pathways. So you can see the blue line is current trends and that remains high, whereas the rest all go below 0, so become a carbon sink. When we consider biodiversity, both pathways do release land for biodiversity. However, the gains are greater in the devolved administration pathways, which is an indication that their policy sort of targets nature and biodiversity more than that of the CCC. And you can see as well the different land use types that we consider for biodiversity, as well as the different contributions of the different countries within this graph. So one of the things from my PhD I was interested in as well is the autonomy of these countries. So if we looked individually and then we aggregated these to the UK, what targets would be met or not. And we found that if we were to prioritise climate targets, we needed a combination of CCC and DA pathways to be able to do that from the devolved administration's results. But for biodiversity, we needed everyone to follow their own pathways to see the greater gains. And you can also see from this graph the different contributions of the countries. So for the carbon sink, For the carbon sink on the figure A, we can see that in the mixed combination, England has the greatest potential to be a carbon sink. However, for biodiversity, Scotland and England can contribute similar to those targets. Yes, so the final part of my PhD, one of the key limitations for Fable is that it is not spatial. So I integrated those land use change projections from Fable with a downscaling module, which was an optimization algorithm to generate land use change maps for the UK in 2050 at 1 kilometre level. So we explored the uncertainty in these land use changes by comparing the 2015 baseline to 2050 for each pixel across 100 samples. This could then be used to locate areas that are more certain to change and therefore require further targeted policy intervention. So I've just provided one of the maps that we created, which looks at the differences across the 100 samples. So anything in red is where, for that pixel, across all 100 samples, it changed from that land use type every time. And conversely, the blue is where it changed to that land use type across every sample each time. So for an example, if we take the middle panel, this is the CCC pathway, where it's characterised by a release of land from agriculture for biodiversity due to productivity increases. And we can see if we focus on Northern Ireland, which is that separated piece of map, there's a lot of red under that intensive grassland category. So we are increasing productivity and releasing land. You can therefore see the increase in the other natural land, which is this column second from the left, where we are converting from intensive to other natural land. This is quite a useful policy tool to be able to show stakeholders, actually, if we were to do these pathways, where might some farmers or land managers need additional support to either transform away from agriculture into more biodiversity measures. So, I'm going to finish with some conclusions from my work. So the study examines the intricate and complex relationships between land use, food production systems for achieving climate and net zero targets, all whilst protecting, restoring and conserving biodiversity through developing national scale pathways. These alternative configurations highlight that there are a multitude of policy options available to decision makers with different trade-offs and synergies. Therefore, the desirability of which may depend on the goals and aspirations of both the national and UK governments. And this multitude of policy options is really useful to our stakeholders to be able to see what might influence what during our land use system. And I found that these results emphasised a pretty key policy question. How can the future land use policy best balance those targets for net zero and those targets for biodiversity and conservation, all whilst continuing to support a thriving agricultural sector? Overall, of course, this research demonstrated that we need significant policy changes. So we need increased ambitions across all of those policy levers. And finally, it also emphasises the need for different integrated strategies across those levels of governance. So coherence between all of those devolved administrations as well as with the UK government. And it also called for a more nuanced understanding of those spatial dynamics to help effectively address those different climate and biodiversity agreements. And I think that is it.
Okay, thank you very much, Sarah. Do we have one or two questions? Okay, I think I saw this hand first.
Thanks very much, Sarah. That was super interesting. So imports and exports are inputs into the model, right?
Yes.
Can you look at the effect of, can you also look at them as kind of outputs, like what the effect of those different land use policies were on imports?
Yeah. So in this study, we kept them constant, just because at the time when we dealt with, especially when we were talking to the Welsh government, there was still a bit of uncertainty about how they might change. Yeah. But it's actually interesting you asked that question, because I've just been talking to some of our IASA colleagues who work on the trade linker tool that was presented earlier this week to see whether we can start testing some of those, because I think that is a limitation of this study, is that because we kept them constant, There's some like informal trade that happens between England, Wales in terms of livestock. So it'd be really interesting if we could, as you say, start to look at exports more of an output rather than an input. So really interesting question, thanks. And stay tuned because it's coming.
It's because in the devolved administration, that last slide you had, cropland under that scenario was predicted to decrease in the southeast, and that's a major agricultural producing region.
So within these pathways, the productivity increases, particularly for cropland, are quite high. So that's where we get that reduction in cropland area because we're intensifying and then releasing that land for biodiversity. But I do agree that there's some sort of imports or exports conversation about because the model's demand driven. So that's how it sort of feeds through. But if we were to keep it steady, to keep remaining as an exporter, that would be slightly different and quite interesting. So stay tuned because hopefully it's coming. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. We'll go back to Miguel's presentation now, if we could get the next slides up.
Thank you. Thank you, John. Sorry. I'm sorry about the delay. I was in another presentation. So I'm Miguel. I'm coming from the University of Coimbra in Portugal. I'm going to present to you mostly what we have been doing in this project, this European project called Europlant. But basically, I'm going to also go into detail on our case study in Portugal, the Castro Verde region. It's a very particular ecosystem that we have in Portugal that I will show you. But we are part of a huge consortium in Europe, 13 partners, where we have 12 countries, 8 case studies. So one of the case studies is, like I mentioned, in Portugal. We have several case studies, so 7 other. The project is not even yet at his halfway, so it started in June 2023. It goes for 4 years project, so it goes until the end of May 27, and focus 3 key research topics that you may have not heard yet: land use sustainable management strategies, climate change mitigation and adaptation, and biodiversity conservation. What are the main objectives of this project? So basically, we want to work, and we will work, and we started actually already working deeply with stakeholders' awareness and engagement, and we want to create multiple policy objectives in a national, regional, and pan-European visions for then the sustainable land use management. That we have 3 different scales: national, regional, and local, particularly the countries that have the case studies. So we have 3 in Western Europe, 5 in Eastern Europe. Most of them are biosphere reserves. So biosphere reserves, as most of you may know, is a classification from UNESCO for that promotes the engagement and promotes the sustainable and the co-creation of sustainable management. And we are basically doing everything based on co-design, co-development, co-creation, co-evaluation. So basically, we will work with stakeholders. We are working with the local communities, particularly in the case studies. But in Castro Verde, we have this very particular ecosystem in Portugal. It's in the south, let's say the central south of Portugal. It's a very particular region along with Spain. So of course in the Iberian Peninsula, it's not only in Portugal but also in the Iberian Peninsula. And why? Because this region is very dry. It's a typical Mediterranean climate area. So it's a bioregion. The bioregion is the Mediterranean. It's very dry. We don't have so much rain there. Typically, so more than 86% or around 86% of the landscape are cereal crops and extensive grasslands. And it is very important for these beautiful species. I present you here 2, but one of them is very, very important, especially because it's even in the icon of the Biosphere Reserve logo. Why? Because this ecosystem here in this region of Portugal and also in Spain, it's called pseudostepic ecosystems. So they are very similar to the stepics in the steppe region of Africa, and some of these migratory birds come to Portugal, come to Spain, and where they nest. So this is very important for the survival of these species. And here in this region, more than 80% of the biosphere reserve is protected under European Natura 2000 network, and it's very important particularly for this species, the great bustard, which has an unfavorable conservation status. We started this project before we have been working with this biosphere reserve. We know already that we worked with the community, and we, from a previous project, we know already the main threats that the communities consider. We know that we ask them what are the main threats that they consider for the ecosystems of this region, and of course the droughts, the soil erosion, and the rural abandonment are the main threats that the communities realized and told us that we should take into account. Regarding the Euro plans, we started this year with a roadmap of the participatory activities. We will have one major participatory activity each year until the end of the project. We already did actually last month, so it was very recent. I will show you very briefly the results of the first co-creation workshop that we did last month with the national authorities. And into 2025, we are already preparing the workshop with the local communities, where we'll do surveys, we will do interviews, we will do participatory workshops, and then we will go until 2027. And the idea is to create policy briefs, land use management guidelines, and integrative governative models for these regions. So the workshop, we did it last month, as I told you. It was a very interesting workshop with stakeholders, national stakeholders from the country, particularly land use management managers, and we asked them basically what were the main challenges that they thought, their perception of the main challenges in Portugal. We had a very interesting result that it was the most answered keyword was knowledge. Also about the solutions, we asked them what are the main solutions that you think that we should focus on. The main answer was communication and awareness, among others, of course, and which were the key factors for land use changing the ranking that we asked them, and of course no, but it was not surprising that it was the economic and the political, the most voted ones. With this, I thank you. As we say, or how the coordinators, the Hamburg University says, let's work together. Let's do this all together to find common solutions. And in name of also of the European project Europlant, I thank your attention. Thank you.
Thank you. Any questions from Miguel? Yes, one here.
Thank you very much for a super interesting presentation. I just wanted to know, on one of the last slides you mentioned that one of the outputs would be, if I'm not wrong, it was integrative governance models.
Yes.
Yeah, exactly. Would you care to elaborate a little bit on what that means, or what that concretely means?
Well, this is a quite new also field for the governance. So basically, we want to include, or we would like to include, basically what comes from the other two topics above it. So from policy briefs, so we would like, or we are planning to have policy briefs, land use management guidelines, and with that, to create this. The integrative is basically to work and to include all the participatory, let's say, opinions and all the information that we will collect from these workshops, from all these participatory activities that we will have during the process or during the project. And especially why? Because we are going to do this at a multi-level scale. We are going to work from the local perspective, regional, especially the countries that have case studies, but also in the pan-European, because one of the things that, thank you for the question, because one of the things that this project is developing is an European platform that is already the alpha version available online. I have some brief, some flyers for those that want to know a bit more about this project. I have it here with me. I can, and I would like also to share with all of you. And these governance models are something like, probably something that we want to be innovative on it. There are not so many that I could tell you, but yeah, but basically we want to create this kind of new platforms. The project is very ambitious, so let's see. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Miguel. Next up, we have Frederico.
Okay. Hi. Thank you for being here. I will present about the Argentinian experience inside the FABLE consortium, a consortium you may have heard of in some of the presentation this week. And I will present our experience in the country regarding the creation of pathways, very similar conceptually with what Sarah presented minutes before, but with the particularities of our country and our needs in this process. So just for this presentation, I will refer to scenarios as key assumptions of the models that we use. I will present then these models very briefly. And the idea is to, through these scenarios, to construct pathways as combination of such scenarios, which are kind of integrative or systemic and aim at an objective for the country. Also, in the context of this presentation, the temporal scale will be a 5-year step values between the year 2000 and 2050. And regarding indicators or variables such as food security, production, trade, land use, biodiversity conservation, and greenhouse gases emissions. And for the spatial part of this integration of models, the scale will be the country level, and we have created maps at the 5 by 5 kilometers resolution. So, what's the reasoning behind this multi-modeling? We started from a series of workshops with stakeholders from the AFOLU sector, agriculture, forestry, and other land uses sector during a project that was called SPIPA, which ended a few years ago. And from that, we tried to find the information we needed to construct the pathways. Then we also use statistical data, mostly from FAO stats, but from other national sources as well, to help construct the models. Of course, we needed land use or land cover maps for the historic period if we wanted to project changes in land use. And finally, a series of information about animal biodiversity. We wanted to include also vegetation biodiversity, but we couldn't find reliable sources for that. Water provision and soil and biomass carbon, because we also wanted to create these pathways in a way that the future we envisage for the country also complies with several other objectives besides reducing greenhouse gases emissions, for example. So we also aimed at protecting biodiversity, the water provision sources, and soil and biomass carbon. Okay, so the logical interconnection between these models is we get the basic information from stakeholders and statistical data, and we use the FABLE calculator, the very same model that Sarah explained briefly before. Thank you for that, so I don't have to repeat. Then we use Dinâmica Ego. It's a Brazilian approach to make especially explicit analysis with maps. So we use this model to to specialize the results from the Fable calculator, basically the land use changes results from the Fable calculator. And we also included a modified version of the nature map project, which aimed at finding the best places to jointly protect several aspects. In our case, we chose water provision or clean water provision, animal biodiversity, and soil and biomass carbon. So, besides this linkage or this line of reasoning, we also aimed, because we were part of other projects as well, at create pathways basically primarily in the reduction of the greenhouse gases emissions. In Argentina, more than half of the greenhouse gases emissions come from the afforestation sector. So we agreed that if we had such results or emissions in the historic period, and we also had a coherent land use representation for this same historic period, we could project the emissions into, for example, a business as usual scenario or pathway, actually, or a current trends pathway to compare it with what Sarah presented. And if we wanted to be more ambitious in terms of reducing the emissions, we could get any other number of pathways with different levels of ambitions in that sense. So we had like a national commitments pathway, which represents all the agreements that the country at least said it would try to comply with. We can have a global sustainability pathway, which is part of the Fable consortium, in which we have several targets, and some of these targets are related to the reduction of greenhouse gases emission. And we also constructed a net carbon pathway, which meant that by 2050, Argentina the afforestation sector in Argentina should be carbon neutral. And in order to get to these visions of the future, we wanted to create long-term strategies, recommendations for the country. And from the workshops with the stakeholders, it was mentioned a few times that since Argentina is such a large country with different ecoregions and different particularities in those ecoregions, we also would need coherent land use projections of such pathways. So I will show very briefly some of the results of two of these pathways, two contrasting pathways, sorry. The current trends, or what if we don't do anything and we continue as we are so far. This is the daily food intake per capita, and we found that in both pathways, Argentina would be able to feed its population, also considering imports and export, as Sarah explained before. And regarding land use changes, here comes the difference between these two pathways. In the current trend pathways, there is an increase in cultivated lands, which is the line in yellow in the graph on the left, because of increased exporting ambitions and increasing population and in food consumption. And the main difference with the other pathway is that this is not the case for national commitments, at least if Argentina were to comply with these commitments that it has made. Regarding other indicators, for example, the share of total land that supports biodiversity or biodiversity conservation, there is an obvious difference if we were to increase cropland area and pasture area compared to what if we are going to stop agricultural expansion and promote reforestation and new afforestation. And regarding greenhouse gases emission, the black dot is the net value. Of course, there is a very important difference between the current trends scenario, where there is no ambition regarding the reduction of greenhouse gases compared to the national commitment, where even though there is still there are still emissions from the livestock sector, mainly the bar in red. The result is very different from the current trends, because there is no expansion, there is no deforestation, and there is afforestation. So what does this mean in special terms? Using Dinamica Ego, we projected the changes of those two pathways into the future. These are, for reference, the values of the years 2000, 2010 and 20 for forests, croplands, pastures, and other lands, including shrublands, other grasslands, etc. And for the current trends, by the year 2050, compared to the national commitments or to a more sustainable scenario in Argentina would mean, you see in green, the forests. There is a very important difference to the north of the country regarding the area of forest. And the other big difference is the cropland area in orange or red. I don't know how you see it. In the current trends, there is like almost double the hectares of croplands compared to the national commitments. And the last model we include is the nature map, or actually based on nature map. It's a prioritization algorithm that finds the best areas to conserve, or to, for example, to create new protected areas, and to stop or do not allow for land use change. And we use the result of these areas as one of the variables in the Dinamica Ego modeling to avoid land use changes, especially from forest to crops or from forest to pastures in those areas. So, besides this linkage between the models, we have the other way between the models, because they go back and forth, and we made several iterations to get our results. So finally, in a parallel project that was also part of this, we discussed with the stakeholders the viability of these scenarios. And just to mention, we found that the current trend is obviously in a scenario that is economically viable, but incompatible with climate and other ambitions that the country has at least signed. And on the other hand, the national commitment pathways, from the point of view of the stakeholders, it's a good pathway, an ambitious pathway in climate or in biodiversity terms, but sadly, it has little to no consensus among them. For example, the Association of Direct Seeding Agriculture or the farming associations of the country. So between these two extreme pathways, we think it's the way we should try to follow in order to create a pathway that it's maybe, if it's possible, both economically viable and both climate and biodiversity compatible. So thank you very much. That'll be all.
Thank you. Do we have a quick question for Federico? No, I will ask my own very quickly then. You suggested that the national commitment is quite ambitious, yet still doesn't quite get us to net negative emissions. And as we've seen in a lot of other talks, kind of AFFLU is demanded by many of the models to be offsetting other sectors. So is there just no chance of even increased ambition, do you think?
Well, we found from the modeling exercises that in order to get, for example, to climate neutrality of the sector, we needed to reforest or afforest at least like 6 million hectares or more, and change radically our diets, or at least our livestock production. Yeah. And that is very ambitious. Not impossible, but very ambitious. Yeah.
Thanks very much, Federico. Next up, we have Steffi, who will talk about cocoa agroforestry in Brazil.
Okay, so good afternoon. My name is Steffi. I'm a PhD student at UCL Louvain in Belgium, but also at a Universidade Estadual de Santa Cruz in Brazil. And today I'm going to present one of the chapters of my PhD that's about trade-offs and synergies of shade tree management in cocoa agroforestry systems in southern Bahia, Brazil. It's still a work in progress, so any feedback, suggestions are more than welcome. Okay, so chocolate consumption is increasing worldwide, and not only in countries like Belgium, but also in emerging economies like Brazil. And this appetite for chocolate is driving up an already high demand for cocoa. And as we all know, the cocoa sector is linked to many issues such as deforestation, the loss of biodiversity and associated ecosystem services, but also prevailing poverty among smallholder farmers. In addition, there is an ongoing intensification trend among farmers where they prefer the low-shaded cocoa agroforestry systems and unshaded monocultures. So they remove the shade trees within their cocoa plantation in an attempt to increase crop productivity and therefore secure short-term income. As a result, this has also many negative implications, such as an increasing need for inputs, especially monocultures, and a decrease in income diversification, and also the biodiversity conservation value of those agroforestry systems. So there has been a lot of study about cocoa in the last decades, but there is still many uncertainties about the potential of cocoa agroforestries to drive sustainability in the supply chain. There has been a lot of focus on the top 3 cocoa producing countries, Côte d'Ivoire and Ghana in West Africa, and Indonesia in Asia. There has also been a lot of focus on sustainability standards like fair trade and UTZ. And there has also been a lot of focus on differences between land use types, for example, monoculture, agroforestry, and forest. But there has been less of attention about differences within agroforestry system as a land use type, and the differences of management practices within those agroforestry systems. So agroforestry systems are still kind of a black box where we could continue our research focus. So that's why my PhD focuses on trade-offs and synergies in cocoa agroforestry systems. And what I'm going to talk about today is the trade-offs and synergies between shade tree management and economic performances in cocoa agroforestry systems. So we use a case study approach and focus on Brazil, which is the 7th largest cocoa producing country in the world. We focus on southern Bahia, where they have the cocoa agroforestry systems, and they are called cabrucas. There we still have 78% of the farmers that grow cocoa in agroforestry systems, and 55% of the producers own less than 20 hectares of land. Unfortunately, there is still like a poverty prevailing among the farmers, and they have a household income near the Brazilian minimum wage. So earlier this year, we collected socioeconomic data using a farm household survey, and we were able to interview 313 farmers. So we used a 3-stage stratified sampling strategy, where we first selected the 12 major cocoa municipalities in southern Bahia. Then we randomly selected 2 to 10 clusters within each municipality. A cluster could be either a farmers' cooperative, an association, but also a community with independent farmers. And then within each cluster, we selected 2 to 8 cocoa farmers, depending on the size of the cluster. Then we use a quantitative structured questionnaires with models that focus on farm household demographics, cocoa production and commercialization, but also management practices and other sources of income, either off-farm or within the farm, for example, on the cocoa agroforestry plots. Then after the interview, we went to the cocoa agroforestry plot with the farmers, and there we established a vegetation plot to determine the number of shade trees within a farm. We distinguish between native and non-native trees. And yeah, so this gives us the environmental indicator shade tree density for the farm, like the cocoa plot. So then as a first step, I use an OLS regression model where I have 5 economic performance variables that are cocoa yield, cocoa production costs, cocoa income, other crops, income from other crops within cocoa agroforestry systems, and household income. Our main indicator, our main independent variable of interest is shade tree density. And I also included other independent variables regarding producers' characteristics and farm characteristics, like for the producer, its age, its education, experience, but also total farm size and cocoa agroforestry plot, but also, for example, the presence of cocoa clones and hybrids. So in the cocoa yield was on average 223 kilograms, which is much lower than, for example, in Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire, where they have around 500 kilograms per hectare. The cocoa production costs were around 187 euros per hectare, and less than 50% of the farmers indicated that they sell other crops within their cocoa agroforestry system for their income. And then cocoa income was around 350 euros per hectare, and the household income was 615 euros. So when we look at the shade tree density gradient, we see that our sample included a very large gradient, going from 40 up to 600 shade trees per hectare. We had a mean value of 192 shade trees, with approximately 60% of native shade trees within a plot. So this is super important because, for example, in Cote d'Ivoire and Ghana, moderate shade is around 13 to 25 shade trees, which is much lower than what we observe in the cabrucas in Bahia. So they are super important ecological value, those cabrucas. So in general, we observe a negative association of the economic performance variables with shade tree density. And we find a significant association of cocoa yield and cocoa production costs with shade tree density. So we find a reduction of cocoa yields with an increase in shade trees. Then for the income of other crops, we did not find a significant association with shade tree density, and we also did not find it for cocoa income and household income. So we did not observe a trade-off of income and shade tree densities within our sample. So this is the Euler's regression output, again showing the significance and non-significance with the economic indicators. We also included shade tree density squared into our model to look for nonlinear relationships of shade tree density with the economic variables, but it was not significant, so implying a linear relation. So the key message is, our OLS regression model as a first step indicate a reduction in cocoa yields and a reduction in cocoa production cost with an increased shade tree density, but we find that cocoa farmers, they earn the same income approximately across our shade tree density gradient. But of course, the first results are OLS regression models. The next step would be to look for causalities, and therefore we are thinking to use an instrumental variable model with distance from the cocoa agroforestry system to the forest as a potential instrument. We also want to look at interactions effects to test synergies and trade-offs within cocoa agroforestry practice. So this meaning that, for example, we want to look at the interaction between sun-resistant varieties of cocoa and that are planted with probably lower shade trees density. So we want to see if there is an interaction or not. And then we also want to use mediation model to analyze direct effects of shade tree density from indirect effects. So for example, controlling for the input to see if shade tree density effect will still be feasible or not. And lastly, I want to thank the enumerators for their hard work and the farmers for their willingness to participate in my survey. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Steffi. Any questions?
Well done. That was really interesting. This is not something I know much about, but I'm curious about the relationship between your two findings. Mm-hmm. So you said that there is a trade-off between shade density and yield, but not between income.
Yeah.
And that is a little surprising, I guess, because I guess yield and income to me are linked. So do you know what the other factors are at play?
Well, we do not find, so we also find a reduction in cocoa costs, which are like the pesticide use, the pesticides and the seed cost, for example. So the OLS regression model, this could like imply that the reduction in yield would be balanced off by the reduced cocoa costs. So, but then again, the next analysis need to like show if this could be like can I say it, like if it's really like that, if there are not like indirect effects, like for example those like I said, presences of hybrids or something like that, it could like explain those differences.
Another question here.
I think my suggestion for you is to control by the age of the cocoa tree.
Yeah.
Because the new varieties, they produce more with less shade.
Yeah,
like and they are new varieties, because of the witch-broom disease. Mm-hmm. I think that would be important for you to control for the age. Yeah, indeed, that's also something we want to look at because like the plantations are very old, and we see that like the more wealthier farmers are using cocoa clones and hybrids and opening up their plantations, but we also need to look at whether it's only in like the low shade tree density part of the gradient, because you don't want to say like you can use hybrids in also high shade tree density because that might not function well.
Great, thank you very much, Steffi. Unfortunately, we have one more question and we have a bit of time, as my unfortunately probably gave away, so one more question here.
Thank you. Thank you very much. My question is kind of different in terms of looking like the income perspective that you're looking at. And I was thinking with a lot of tree shade cover, that means they're having a lot of trees within their cocoa plantations, right? Are they making income from like cutting the woods or pruning the woods for like bioenergy, reducing kind of like costs spent on energy in that case? So it's just something I'm curious about.
Just to check if I understood well, so you're saying like the costs for cutting the trees?
No. In rural areas, it's very common to purchase wood for like energy. And I was just asking, in the point or in the aspect of where they manage the trees and they prune them, could maybe that saving them some cost in terms of like getting wood from their plantation, and maybe that's an income in another, or like, would I say reduction in their cost of living in that case?
Yeah, okay, I understand. Yeah, that could be something I could look into as well. I'm not sure if they are doing that a lot in the region where I am, but yeah, I can check that with when I go back in Brazil with for additional interviews, perhaps. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Yes, so as Aline said at the start, unfortunately, Daniela has had to leave the conference a bit early, so he won't be able to present today. If you were interested in his topic on urban nature-based solutions, please reach out to him, and yeah, he sends his apologies. So instead, we'll go next up to Mitch, who is going to talk about biodiversity credits.
It's not my slide, though. Well, while we're waiting for my slides, I want to thank everybody for coming to the talk and making it through almost to the end of the meeting. And what I wanted to do today is to share my ideas of the biodiversity credit markets. And, you know, there's the title, but to me the real question is this a scam or is it a solution? And today I think it's a scam, but I don't think it's going to go away, just like the carbon market hasn't gone away. And so I think it's important that we work on trying to make this into something that can actually be a solution. One of the reasons the biodiversity credit market got started is that there was these analyses of where we are in terms of funding for conservation activities. And the people that did this work identified a huge gap, and one of the ways that they thought they could fill this gap for biodiversity or conservation was to create this biodiversity credit market. But if we look at the news that came out of the COP in Cali just a week ago, it doesn't sound like it's been very good. They've said that they've sold less than $1 million in biodiversity credits, that there are few buyers, and they're concerned about the inconsistencies. One of the things that has happened is popped up many different companies offering different credits based on different protocols, and it's confusing. One of the reasons it's confusing, or people are hesitant to invest in this, is that I think there's many similarities with the carbon market. And as you can see in these articles, that there's been very, very strong criticism about the carbon market over the last 20 years. The biodiversity market is virtually a cut and paste of the carbon market, and we have serious problems. These articles are identifying 85 to 90% of the credits that have been issued really didn't do anything. And even worse, about a month ago, this person who was on the board of directors of Vera, which is one of the biggest companies verifying this project, was accused of fraud for inventing the amount of credits that his company was producing. So there's serious problems. What are the problems with the carbon credit market? Number one is unrealistic baselines, and I'm going to go into a little bit more details about that in a minute. The other is there's no additionality. The idea of these projects are that you do something above business as usual, and that hasn't been the case in many of these projects. There's short-term permanence. When they've been successful and they've gotten forests to grow, fires come through, people go in and deforest these areas, but the carbon credits have already been sold. Another problem is undocumented leakage. Maybe you go in and you buy land to do a restoration project, but the money that you paid for that land can be taken to the frontiers, buy 10 times as much land, deforest that, convert it back to pasture or to pastures, and so the net effect can often be not just neutral, but negative. And finally, one of the main problems with a lot of these projects is there's no good transparency about the data, the way they're being evaluated, how the credits are being distributed, and how the money from those credits is being distributed amongst the participants in the project. So my question is, will biodiversity credit projects face the same problems? I think it'll be even worse. No, we understand the carbon cycle. Everyone in this room probably has a different definition of biodiversity. And how should we go about monitoring or quantifying biodiversity? It's much, much more complicated. So yes, I think we're going to have a lot more problems with this market. There's many aspects of running a biodiversity credit project, but I think there's 3 points where we can have can improve these projects. One is baseline, one is monitoring, and one is independent verification. When I talk about baseline, when a company goes in to start a project, they have to say what is going to be business as usual. What is the baseline? In the case of this, it's a conservation project. The baseline would be the blue line. And so what this project is saying is that if we don't do anything, they'll come in, they'll deforest this area. In 30 years, we'll have lost 50% of the biodiversity or the carbon in the system. And then the project is approved. They go on and do the activities, the green line. So maybe they invest in park guards. And at the end of the project, they've been successful to maintain the biodiversity in this place, and they gain all of that difference between the blue and green line. But what they haven't done is really have a control. And in a lot of places, if they had had a control, they would have found out that their baseline was probably very exaggerated. No? And so maybe the investment in protection of those sites did make a difference, but it didn't make as much a difference as it could have if they had really included a control. Okay? And this is a control that is monitored throughout the life of the project, not just a theoretical one based on the original proposal. Another type of project that they're proposing are restoration projects, where in this case, the baseline, the blue line, might be, say, an abandoned pasture where the soils are degraded and that the regeneration is going to be very poor. Maybe they say that it's going to be colonized by ferns, the succession is arrested, and after 30 years there's virtually no biodiversity in these sites, where in the project, the green line, they're going to plant trees, the forest will recover, the birds will come in, and they'll gain a lot more additionality. Again, if we had put a control in, and we had monitored all the same variables in the control as we did in the project site, we might find out that we didn't really have as much additional effect than what was originally proposed. So, recommendations, let's have controls. and not in controls that are monitored at the same intensity throughout the lifetime of the project. There is a nice paper that was published in Science this year that did this. They were looking at the positive impacts of conservation action, and they looked for projects where there were controls and there were treatments. They didn't find a lot, because we often just assume that if we're doing some type of treatment for conservation, it's going to be positive. And one of the things that they found out is that when you have a counterfactual, the top panels, you can find projects that did have a positive effect. Unfortunately, in their review of the literature, they also found the reverse, where the treatment had a negative effect on the biodiversity. So baselines are important. The other thing, this is a biodiversity market. We need to be monitoring biodiversity. We have tools to monitor hundreds of species. We have tools that can now automate data collection, analysis, species identification. We should use the cutting edge technology that exists for monitoring the biodiversity. And last is, who's going to verify this project? Right now, the companies, they contract the company that comes in and does the independent verification. To me, there's a conflict of interest there. I would propose that each country sets up an agency that does all of these parts, that runs the biodiversity credit market within the country. They define the rules of the game. They evaluate the proposals. They do the verification. They get a fee to sponsor, to fund this institute. This would make it much more easy for the investors to understand what's going on and at the same time have a positive effect for the country. So, in summary, multiple dynamic baselines, monitor more than just habitat, and take the independent review seriously and create an institute within the country to do this. So, is it a scam or a solution?
Thank you. Any questions? Yes, very quick hand up. So.
Quick hand up for a quick question. So a lot of the people investing in carbon markets are looking to minimize their dollar for maximum investment. How do you do appropriate case control in a carbon market in a way that doesn't double costs?
No. That's a good question. What I'm proposing is at the minimum doubling the cost of doing the monitoring. But if you have to, to do it right, if you don't monitor actively a baseline, you don't know the impact that you're having. And if that's the real cost of doing a good project, that needs to get included into the prices of carbon.
Thanks. I think, yeah, there's lots of hands. I saw this one first.
Thanks very much. I was wondering what your thoughts are on sort of top-down national regulation. So in the UK, obviously, we have quite an interesting development now with biodiversity net gain, which offers many co-benefits for farmers because it's low input on parts of their land. And that's 30-year guarantee, development co-developed with ecologists. We'll see how it goes, whether it turns out to be a solution or a scam further down the line. But what role do you see, particularly in our high biodiversity regions of the world, that sort of top-down regulation playing?
To me, I mean, one of the things that we're working on now is a proposal to get money to bring together biologists just to figure out the monitoring. That's the easy part. The other is to bring in the NGOs, the private sector, the lawyers, and the national government to try to form an agency like this. And the idea is to do this in Peru and in Argentina. And the idea is, if you can pull this off, that maybe then the process of working with those people, trying to form this institute, I think we can learn a lot and then see if that is applicable to other countries. Huh? Well, I mean, one of the things to me that's interesting is when we look at conservation, starts in, say, you know, activities really in the 80s and early 90s, it was in academics. Then it shifts to NGOs. And today, it's the market. And you know, why it has taken that trajectory to me is really interesting. And you know, maybe we weren't as successful as academics, the NGOs weren't successful, now we're trying something else. But the idea that markets are going to solve the problems, and in a lot of ways the market's created, doesn't make sense to me.
We have the luxury of a little spare time, so given there were so many hands, some more questions.
You started the presentation by pointing out that the amount of funding that's gone into biodiversity credits is much less than what was expected. How does making it more expensive to do this solve that problem?
Yeah, I think this is, I'm not sure I followed your question.
You said that the problem, one of the problems is that there's the amount of money that's being committed doesn't actually translate into the actual money that's flowing into these markets and then not needed.
Yes.
And
yes.
You identified a separate issue, which is that the monitoring is failing and that whatever's claiming to be a credit is not. And an interesting solution that you propose, you know, in the carbon market you have Vera, third-party actors. The interesting suggestion you have is to nationalize the monitoring space.
Yes.
I think that's interesting. But I was wondering, how does that really help the actual flow of funds into this space?
Because the money into to me, cutting out the middleman is something that's important. I mean, these carbon projects that have been criticized and haven't worked and haven't fixed carbon, it doesn't affect the budget of Vera. Vera made their money and they left. And now if you cut the middlemen out, move their activities to a regional, a country institute, there's a lot more long-term interest in making sure that these projects actually function. I don't know if that balances out the question of doubling the cost of monitoring, and on one hand you increase it, but if you remove the middleman, maybe the prices are not so far off.
I have one last burning question at the back, staring me down.
Yeah, thanks, Craig Beatty from WWF US. 2 questions, but they're connected. First of all, how do you see biodiversity credits working in terms of offsets for biodiversity losses? And then follow-up, if there are national systems for biodiversity credit markets, do you see biodiversity credits as being fungible among countries with markets?
Thank you. First, I think that the strongest, I mean, one thing that is important that people are trying to make clear, that offsets are one thing, and that's, you know, and the voluntary market is another. You know? Offset is, by law, a company has done some damage to biodiversity, and they're required by law to do some replacement or mitigation. And so what I'm focusing on right now is the voluntary market. Okay? One of the things that having them be fungible between countries, right now I think there's over 40 different companies that are offering biodiversity credits, and it goes from a single species to hedgerows to a handful of species. I think it'd be very, very difficult for it to get to the level where it's fungible between countries. And that's one of the things that I think that would be attractive if it is done at a country level. A country can define the rules of the biodiversity credit market within Peru, and perhaps within Peru, those credits could be fungible.
Great, thanks very much, Mitch. Clearly a topic that inspires a lot of debate, and one suspects will continue to do so. The last speaker now of our session is Jess, who will talk about carbon opportunity costs.
Hi, everyone. We've made it to the end of a really productive couple of days. Thank you all for coming to this session, and I'm excited to give my first ever conference presentation. So I'm a PhD student at Oxford, and today I'm presenting one of the chapters of my thesis called Incorporating the Carbon Opportunity Cost into Farm Subsidy Schemes, and I'm looking at the context specifically in the UK and sort of what's going on with the post-Brexit subsidy developments. This is supposed to be a flash talk. I may use all of the time I have to speak, but then I greatly welcome all comments, questions, feedback during the rest of the afternoon. So, context that we're all well aware of. Land is finite, and yet pressures on land are growing. I've noticed a trend in developed world climate mitigation strategies at the national level, often involving dedicating land to carbon storage and or shifting to lower emissions, which sometimes also means lower yield practices in the name of biodiversity. For net importer countries of food like the UK, this will likely mean importing more food in the absence of drastic diet shifts, which the models which are used to come up with these strategies often assume, and whether or not that's an appropriate assumption, I would love to debate. So therefore, I argue that we need to consider the impact of producing this lost food elsewhere in order to understand the true global net impact of these incentives. So that brings us to the carbon opportunity cost. You may have heard of it. Some others have spoken about it this week. The core assumption is that if 1 hectare were not used to produce food, that food would be produced elsewhere at its global average carbon cost. And so this is sort of representative of historical carbon loss or foregone sequestration due to land being used to produce food. And this paper in Nature from 2018 comes from my former boss at the World Resource Institute, Tim Searchinger. So in the UK, as I mentioned, I'm looking at these post-Brexit subsidies called the environmental land management schemes, which are incentivizing what some might call sort of conservation or regenerative agriculture practices. And we know from vast literature that these practices can have widely varying effects on yield, not only globally, but even just within a single country or a single region. And we also have limited data on the greenhouse gas effects of some of these practices. So the first step in my analysis is what I'm affectionately calling reverse meta-analysis, where I looked at all of these meta-analyses of yield effects of the activities that the UK says it wants to subsidize, and I took all of the values that are relevant only to the UK. So for all of these practices, which are included in ELMS, we have the range of the percent change in yield, and there are 2 important things that I want to bring attention to here. One is that with the exception of organic, we can't really use the data to say with any kind of certainty what the effect will be. You have many practices ranging from great yield losses to great yield gains, and I don't think we know enough about what caused those differences to say anything definitive about it. And secondly, I just want to draw attention to the magnitude of some of these ranges. For intercropping, for example, you have yield loss of 60% to yield gain of 60%. And another interesting thing to note is that a lot of this data came from sort of the 80s, early 90s, when there was sort of an influx of funding into doing these sorts of studies, and they have not since been repeated. So we also don't know sort of how these results would translate into modern day. So I'm going to show you an example in a moment of this simple Excel tool that I built, and we're going to look at organic, shifting to organic. So this aforementioned model, it's very simple. It's in Excel because, unfortunately, that is the extent of my computational skills. So the inputs, you basically put in what crop you are farming, what your baseline yield is, how much nitrogen you're applying, and information about things like on-farm emissions from, equipment and whatnot. And then you make decisions about which practice or intervention you're going to implement and what you are kind of assuming that will do to emissions. And obviously we can do sort of sensitivity around that because that is kind of an uncertainty. And the outputs, which I'll show you in a moment, are the avoided emissions from the intervention, the range of carbon opportunity costs due to lost or gained productivity, and then the net benefits. So this is what my sort of output looks like. So this is an example of shifting from conventional to organic barley production and assuming a 50% emissions reduction per hectare. So first we have avoided emissions, which using conventional emissions accounting schemes, this is all that we count at the moment. And it's independent of change in yield, so that's why it's a horizontal line. But then next we have the carbon opportunity cost, which is entirely dependent on the change in yield. And so basically if you have a drop in yield, that's a cost. If you have a gain in yield, you're alleviating the need to clear more land elsewhere, so it's a benefit. And the three dots that you see along the line are the lower bound, the average, and the upper bound of the ranges that I showed in the previous figure. And then we have the important thing, which is the net impact, which is the difference between those two lines. And because in this example, over half of the data points show a loss in yield, and the net benefit, also half of that is negative, this suggests that there's a reasonable chance that if we pursue this intervention, it could lead to a net carbon cost. So what exactly does this figure tell us? It tells us two important things. The first is that there are untapped carbon benefits, that farmers are not getting credit for improving productivity on farms. But then, conversely, there's uncounted carbon costs. So we're effectively incentivizing the further offshoring of food production, which, as I said, for a net import country like the UK, this is a critical touch point. So what should we do about this? First of all, we should encourage policymakers working on these subsidy schemes to consider the global consequences of the interventions that they're incentivizing, which may reduce food production domestically. And then lastly, we can use a tool like this or conceptual framework like this to identify the practices which are a win not only for climate and farmers, but also national biodiversity. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. Any questions for Jess? Yes, one at the back. Try and be quick.
Yeah, really, really interesting study. I was wondering if on the last slide you showed you mentioned a untapped carbon opportunity, and maybe I just don't understand it, but because the yields of organic is lower, right? So how do you quantify it?
Well, so based on the range that I showed, organic isn't always lower yield. Generally speaking, yes, but according to the literature, not in every case. And the sort of marginal gain is potentially small, but it's not zero. And so, going back to the previous point that I made about how, we don't know where on the spectrum of the yield range a given hectare of land would fall. It's hard to kind of use this tool, for example, at the specific farm level, but it's more to demonstrate that if we can identify practices where, for example, by updating some of the data that we have, if we're able to identify practices that we can have a little more certainty would increase yields, then there's a potential to sort of use a tool like this to incentivize pursuing those practices.
Another question here.
Thanks very much. On your meta-analysis slide, on the summary, you had crop residues. Is that using residues for BECCS? And if so, have you looked into the kind of carbon accounting of that regards the sort of bioenergy benefit, or are you going to do that?
So that is not BECCS, and it's not, yeah, so that's basically one of the kind of regenerative practices is sort of to leave crop residues on the field to kind of maintain soil health and potentially, hypothetically, lock in some additional soil carbon. And yeah, we can talk about BECCS. I have feelings about it, and I don't want to get into that right now.
Thanks, Jess. Okay, one last question for Jess.
Thanks, Jess. Super interesting. I wonder if you could reflect a little bit on kind of the economic, what I think is a kind of classic economic argument against using the carbon opportunity cost as kind of a one-to-one relationship, insofar as where, you know, in cases where a new intervention decreases yields, the economic theory would suggest that that could lead to increased prices, which can lead to an extensification or intensification elsewhere. So it may not be a one-to-one relationship. I think that your group and Tim at WRI have been kind of facing that argument in a few different ways, and I just wonder if you could respond to that.
Yeah, totally. Thank you for that question. That's definitely a generally very important point. I think it's kind of counteracted in this exact instance because these practices are being subsidized. So farmers are getting money for doing these things. So even if they have a slight drop in yield, it wouldn't necessarily affect prices because there are other co-benefits that they're getting paid for. Does that answer you? Okay, we can talk more.
Yeah, we've had a very stimulating session. Fantastic to see so much work going on, looking at challenges, opportunities, tools for better decision-making around land use. Especially good to see how we are thinking about more than carbon or more than one issue at a time. And also from some of the case studies, how we're increasingly bringing in and co-creating stakeholders. So we are nearly out of time, so I'll wrap up a bit early. Please have a chat and find any speakers if you want to continue the conversation. But just to wrap up, let's all please have a round of applause to thank all our excellent speakers.